Burning tires, barricaded roads, the burning and the destruction of public property and infrastructure. It's an all too common occurrence across South Africa's townships whenever service delivery protests take place. And at the forefront of these protests, young, black, unemployed youths leading the charge. The recent protests in the northwest that called for the removal of Supra Mahumapelo as premier of the province saw 35 minors being arrested for public violence.
Young people were used to do those crimes, and they were used by their parents, more especially by their parents. But as leaders, what are we saying about those young people?
Some say the culture of violent protests with young people in the forefront can be traced back to the Soweto student uprisings of 1976. That uprising led to widespread insurrectionary violence across South African townships. But it's worth noting, however, that the 1976 uprisings were indeed peaceful. Until, of course, the students were met with brute force from the apartheid state. And some say the 80s was a seminal point of when the violent culture of protests in South Africa was firmly entrenched. But why is it that 24 years after the attainment of democracy, people still feel the need to burn, to loot, and to tear down public property and infrastructure for their grievances to be heard?
And now there's this culture all of a sudden that if I burn tires, if I burn a school, if I burn a clinic, if I burn a library, if I burn whatever is government offices, wherever they are, then government will give attention to us. They will come running. And indeed, we have been going running each time there's a protest of that nature that is violent. And that should not be the culture. The culture must be consistent, continuous communication that is going to the people at all given times.
Is it unemployment, idleness, a feeling of hopelessness, of not being listened to by the government perhaps, that leads young people to resort to such violence during service delivery protests?
The youth is getting impatient, and maybe the classic impatience is manifested through the protests at universities, fees must fall, and so forth. And if we don't engage with them and bring their participation and their energy and innovation into driving the implementation of the plan, then we are just creating a plan for people who are not participants. And that will not be really the meaning of what the NDP was developed for.
But the violence, no matter how legitimate the grievance, remains unacceptable. And it's not without its consequences, especially for young people.
I want to say to the minors, they must not waste their future, because you're going to have records which are going to be used against them whilst they are going to look at for employment as time goes on.
While the Constitution does protect people's rights to protest, it's worth considering that violent protests not only lead to the damage of infrastructure, but also to the country's image. President Cyril Ramaphosa, for example, had to cut short an important trip abroad to resolve the Northwest issue.
If there's a genuine protest, why people go and loot? So indeed, there are those criminal elements who are taking advantage of this situation.
So what should be done to ensure that our youth are playing a meaningful role in the country's economy instead of engaging in violent protests that offer little prospects for their future?
We've got to find new places, new spaces, new faces, new industries, and very importantly, new pathways for these 5.9 million young people to walk. It is a big number. It is a third of our youth population.
As you can see, we are raising our hand to be part of the solution, because we don't believe that you must now and then make revolutionary sounding slogans. But we believe that as young people we must engage through the strength of our own ideas. If we have any grievances, it won't help us to shout in a corner and not come to the fore with ideas that may put a dent or bring opportunities to young people.
Tumiso Mashaba, SABC News.